is Healthcare Now Radio's Interviews Now. Thank you for joining us. I'm Shereese Maynard, today's host. Follow our show with the hashtag Interviews Now and join the conversation. In this fast-paced, ever-changing landscape we call healthcare delivery, who can we trust to tell us, good or bad, what's happening now? Let us help you sort out these issues with today's thought leaders in the know. On this episode, we'll be discussing clinical communications with our amazing guest, Terry Edwars, President and CEO from PerfectServe. Hi, Terry. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Shereese. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the program.
Sure. So I'd like to know a little bit about your background and how is it you found yourself in the health IT space?
Well, it was somewhat serendipitous. I started my career as a commercial photographer, and it actually started a business that eventually became a full-service marketing communications company in the Midwest. And when I was in my early 30s, I was really looking to make a career change. Mm-hmm. And this was in the early 90s. And I had an opportunity to move to Knoxville, Tennessee, and open up the Knoxville operations for a company called VoiceTel, which was at that time a very innovative technology service provider. VoiceTel was using the telephone at that time to do what we do today with email and texting, and that is asynchronous communication. And we had a network that ran all over the country and up into Canada and Australia, oh, wow. and people had accounts in different cities, and we could carry on conversations, but not in real time.
Wow.
And once we were settled, my wife, who is a registered nurse, went to work for a solo practice pediatrician, and she started taking call for this doctor on the weekends. And I would observe the process of how the patient would call the office, the phone would be forwarded to an answering service, the patient would then sit on hold, an answering service agent would take a message, they would send a page to my wife, she would call back, she would sit on hold, she would talk to a different agent and get the message secondhand, and then attempt to contact the patient back. And on a Saturday morning in a pediatrician's office, she could call in and get 7 or 8 messages, so it could take several hours to complete a whole communication cycle.
Right.
And I'm like, there's got to be a way to apply technology like VoiceTel has to solve this problem. So I went out and started talking to physicians and practice managers, and I learned that there were just a whole host of challenges in managing inbound communication into these clinic sites. And so I spent some time trying to work on this problem at VoiceTel, and really couldn't get VoiceTel to go or get behind it. So that led to me leaving and starting what has now become PerfectServe.
Wow. Well, that actually is a good segue into our first question because, communications, when you think about it in the healthcare space, is a challenge that is not addressed all the time as it should be. So when we're talking about consumer communication technologies, they're very advanced. But healthcare, I always say, like British fashion is always 5 years behind the trend. Why do you think healthcare communication systems are still so fragmented, and how do we find ourselves here?
Well, I think the big issue has to do with the fact that care delivery is delivered by groups of people who are in little teams. Sometimes they're part of the same organization. So think of a large health system like let's say an Advocate Medical Group in Chicago, which has 12 hospitals and probably 3,000 or 4,000 employed doctors working in clinics all over the Chicago metro area. Within that very large organization, those clinics each have a workflow that's unique. And in each one of the hospitals, the departments have unique workflows. And so you can't just send communication in just blindly. You have to do it in a way that meets the workflow of the group. So, for example, doctors aren't sitting at their desk ready to answer a phone call anytime one comes in. Right. Doctors have to spend their time seeing patients. And so during the clinic Patient hours, the communication are directed to the front office. Those things that are clinical are directed to nurses. And then, nurses will consult with the doctors as required. And even when communication is directed to nurses, they're not always available because they're supporting the doctors. So there's a lot of messaging that occurs, and it's not always efficient. And so the big challenge is, how do you address the workflows of the recipients? And in addition to that, in the hospital environment, we have had nursing-centric solutions that tend to be very device-oriented,
Right.
And they are centered around the inbound communication workflow of a practice, of a department, which is very different than that of the physicians and their medical practices. So doctors, interestingly, the healthcare will get slammed for not adopting technology, but doctors have been early adopters of technology, for years. I mean, back in the 80s, They were first adopters of pagers. They were early adopters of cell phones. They were the vanguard on, smartphone devices into healthcare. But many of the others have lagged, and they've lagged because of these infrastructure challenges, and/or like with nurses, the BYOD doesn't really work in many cases. There are union rules and things like that limit that. And then in addition to that, you have this need for security to be compliant with HIPAA, which makes things even more complex. So there's complex workflows, complex deployments of technology, not complex, just varieties of deployments of different kinds of technologies, and that's one of the things that makes it challenging.
And then you add to that, the places where we're caring for patients is now changing. I suspect that healthcare's migration into outpatient and home settings makes this problem even more complicated.
It does. I mean, as you start to break it down, there's cares provided in clinic sites. There's care provided in hospitals. Hospitals have for years been moving more and more and more to the outpatient environment. And when patients do come in for an episode, it's like, let's get them out of this expensive care setting as quickly as we can. But that doesn't mean that the delivery of care is done. It's just that the care team changes and evolves. So that care team that was inside the hospital will transition the care to a care team that's now outside the hospital. And that care team, might include that patient's primary care doctor, one or two, or, half a dozen different specialists. There could be home care involved, transport, those providers of durable medical, products and goods such as oxygen, as well as the family member. And so coordinating, and enabling those different providers to coordinate is a real challenge.
Yeah. And then the tools we're using to coordinate that care nowadays has also contributed to the problem. So where do you see EHRs fitting into this puzzle? Once upon a time, we all believed that they would be instrumental in helping us to communicate more effectively during the clinical episode. What's happened, and what do you think is going on with EHRs?
Well, I think that there was too much promise put in the EHR, and which is too bad. The reality has proven different, and I think it's very frustrating. After we as a country spent some $37 billion to digitize the healthcare system, but the good is that even though the solutions aren't where they need to be, we are miles ahead in terms of trying to get towards a more effective digital strategy within the industry. And now when it comes to communication, one of the problems with the EMR is I think many in the industry will look at it, they're still looking at it like a panacea, that, it's an end all and a be all. And of the leading EMR companies, both Cerner and Epic have initiatives within the communication space
Mm-hmm.
But when you really look at and study the challenges of near-time and real-time communication, those communications that are urgent, time-sensitive, they're unexpected, there's a whole host that occurs outside the EMR. And it needs to occur outside the EMR because it needs to include users who are not users of the EMR. And so what's really needed to realize effective collaboration is a solution that transcends above the EMR to encompass it as well as go beyond it. It needs to work with the EMR and from an integration standpoint to receive data from it, to be able to write data back. But the EMR at its core is solving a different problem than the clinical communication and collaboration product set needs to solve.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Interviews Now on Healthcare Now Radio, and I'm Shereese Maynard, speaking on clinical communications with Terry Edwars. So Terry, tell me, what do you think is the answer here? Could you share your vision for the type of clinical collaboration you've just described?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing this at various levels with a number of our health system clients, but you have to look at the entire ecosystem within a community. And you can't. You've got providers, for example, doctors who are seeing patients in multiple hospitals who might be within competing systems. They're independent. They could be employed. Those that are employed tend to be tied to one system, so they're more vertically integrated. But you've got to have a platform that goes outside the four walls of the hospital and goes outside even the four walls of the clinic to connect and tie users together. And that's how we architected our platform from the beginning. And in that way, what you're able to do is break down the barriers. You're able to break down the friction and the silos that impede effective collaboration.
And I think we can all agree that collaboration is the way forward. But the clinical collaboration PerfectServe makes happen for your customers sounds really fabulous, actually. I've actually been following you guys for a while. When collaboration doesn't occur, though, we know that there are care delays. So what makes your product a little bit different and unique for clinical settings?
Well, there's probably three things, and of those three, there's two that are really, really essential. And the first is what has been PerfectServe's core differentiator since we started the company, and that is this capability that we refer to called dynamic intelligent routing. And it's the heart of our platform, and what it does is it allows us to build algorithms in software that consider all of the if-then variables that are at play in a communication process to determine whom should be contacted and how that person should be contacted at any given moment in time. And so in that way, with dynamic intelligent routing, if I'm a nurse on the floor, for example, and I think I need Dr. Smith, that's all I need to know is just Dr. Smith. And I click on Dr. Smith in the directory, whether it's through the mobile app or the web, or I speak it over the phone. And then PerfectServe will invoke, through dynamic intelligent routing, the algorithms that pertain to Dr. Smith at that moment in time. And we'll be considering the time of day, the day of week, the originating department, perhaps the clinical situation or the reason, as well as the urgency. And then it's like kind of an easy button for that nurse to connect to the person who can respond and take action at that moment in time. And it's with that we have proven that we can dramatically reduce cycle times because the process is accurate and very reliable. So that's essential, because if you cannot automate the workflows that exist and or improve those that exist, then you really can't drive adoption.
Right.
The second thing that is key to our solution is our cloud-based architecture. That's absolutely essential. You cannot take a client-server on-premise based solution and serve a broader community of providers, because the solution has to go beyond that organization. And that's one of the problems within the nursing communication space right now, is the companies who have really been the leaders in that space historically use on-prem server-centric solutions that can't go beyond the four walls of the hospital, so they become less effective, for example, in dealing with all the physicians or the post-acute care providers. Those users are just not included, and so you're not able to facilitate the kind of communication that needs to occur to affect collaboration. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I think for us is just the comprehensiveness of the solution. As I'm describing this, I'm also, you have to think about the different constituents. So while people will want to connect, the needs of an acute care hospital are different than the needs of a physician practice, which might be different than a post-acute care facility. And so you just can't come in and say, I've got something that's good for the hospital, but it's not really good for the others, and get adoption. You have to have solutions. We'd have them in the form of modules that optimize the acute care environment, that optimize the clinic environment, that optimize the post-acute. And so that comprehensiveness is a key element of our solution as well.
And I do find that the comprehensive solutions are what is missing from a lot of different or other platforms out there. So finally, you mentioned communicating with patients during our initial question. Can you elaborate on what this might look like within a real-time clinical collaboration platform?
Yeah, I think the thing about the patients, we observed, as I told you, we got started in the physician's clinic, and we started by managing and automating the phone calls that come into clinics. And still to this day, the phone is the primary way most patients interact with their doctor's office. There are some successful deployments of EHR portals, but they've really been very limited to date. And so we know the nature of those communications. We know how they need to route for the various specialties. And so some of what's driving our initiatives right now around engaging the patient in the solution is to give the patient an option through a mobile application, for example, to either make a call or send a text based on the situation. And so that's one area, just replacing what's done via the phone with text and a mobile app. There are many other opportunities as well. And I talked earlier, for example, about the care team. And we've done some things to really optimize the care team in the acute care environment, but being able to add the patient and the patient's family member as a care team member, we think is really essential going forward. And so there's work underway to do that. So I might, for example, have an application as a caregiver for my mother. And I'm able to click on the care team, for example, and see who her primary care doctor is, see who her specialists are, see, if she's under any kind of home care or whatever, see who that is, and then facilitate communication with those providers at a given moment in time, as well as allowing those providers to easily communicate with me when it's required. So there are other opportunities which I could probably carry on about for a while, but I'll just pause right there, just as sort of thought starters in this space.
Well, I'm actually glad you mentioned about the patient and their caregiver being added in as part of the care team. I think it's often overlooked, but that's kind of exciting. I'm glad you joined us today to talk about some of the things you guys are doing, and I would hope that others would have an opportunity to look at PerfectServe. I want to thank my guest, Terry Edwars, for joining me today. To learn more about PerfectServe, find them at perfectserve.com or follow them on Twitter at PerfectServe. Thank you so much, Terry, for coming today.
Thank you, Shereese. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure talking to you. You have a good day. I want to thank my guest, Terry Edwars of PerfectServe, for joining me today. To learn more about PerfectServe, find them at perfectserve.com or follow them on Twitter at PerfectServe. And thank you for tuning in today. For more information about Interviews Now, visit our show's program page on healthcarenowradio.com. And until next time, if it's happening in healthcare and it's now, it's on Interviews Now.